Nia had lived 23 years in the village of Mbana, yet some days she wondered if anyone truly knew she existed. She moved through the dusty paths like a shadow, slipping between bodies that never turned toward her, listening to conversations that continued even when she stood beside the speakers. At the market, women argued loudly over baskets of red peppers, greeting everyone they recognized, even shouting across stalls to call friends closer. But when Nia paused to buy millet or cassava, the seller looked past her as if her presence were a breeze rather than a person. She would speak softly, place her coins carefully on the woven mat, and watch the seller startle as though the money had appeared on its own. Her mother rarely addressed her unless she needed an errand done. Her siblings made plans for the day, laughed and traded stories, all while she stood close enough to hear every detail yet never received a glance. Even during meals, when the family gathered around the low wooden table, her father distributed portions without looking her way, leaving her to serve herself last, long after everyone had begun eating. Yet beneath her silence there was a deep, steady strength that nobody noticed. Nia listened, observed, remembered. She carried the stories of the village in her mind like stones in a river, polished from constant motion. She knew who harvested first, who quarreled with their neighbor, who sang to their newborn child late at night. She knew the scent of each rising fire at dawn and the rhythm of each woman pounding fufu. While others ignored her, she saw everything. Walking through Mbana was like moving through a living mural painted with color and motion. She admired the painted calabashes hanging outside doorways, the bright kitenge cloths billowing from laundry lines, the giant baobab tree standing at the center of the village with its thick trunk like a guardian of old memories. From sunrise to the deep purple hours of evening, life in Mbana pulsed with sound, goats bleating, children racing after each other, drums signaling gatherings and warnings. Nia loved the village even if the village pretended she did not exist. When she fetched water at the well, other girls chatted easily beside her but never once asked her opinion or included her in their chatter. They talked around her as if she were air filling the space between them. If she accidentally brushed someone's shoulder, the person flinched and frowned, not at her, but at the empty place they thought had touched them. Despite the sharp sting she felt each time she was overlooked, she refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she swallowed her hurt, pressing it into the growing ember that burned inside her chest. It was a quiet fire, one that warmed her on lonely nights and reminded her she was alive even if no one seemed to notice. Sometimes she wondered why the world treated her this way. Was her voice too soft? Her steps too light? Her presence too gentle to hold space among people who filled every moment with sound and importance? But then she would pause, inhale the warm evening air scented with wood smoke and roasting groundnuts, and remember that invisibility did not mean emptiness. She felt things deeply, loved fiercely, dreamed boldly, even if her dreams were hidden beneath layers of silence. At night, when the village settled into darkness, she lay on her raffia mat and listened to the distant hum of drums from a celebration she had not been invited to. The fire in her chest flickered, steady and determined. She imagined a life where people saw her, truly saw her, not as a shadow passing by, not as an afterthought, but as someone whose presence carried weight. She promised herself that one day, whether through her own strength or something greater, they would finally realize she had been there all along. 4 days leading up to her disappearance, Nia's silence deepened into something heavier than the quiet she had lived with all her life. She stopped greeting the goats she usually fed behind the house. She stopped humming the soft melodies she invented while sweeping the compound at dawn. Most of all, she stopped speaking entirely. At first, no one in her family noticed. They were used to her soft voice, used to conversations where she contributed nothing because no one waited for her to speak. Her mother asked her to fetch water without looking up from her grinding stone. Her siblings talked over her at breakfast, arguing about who would carry firewood that afternoon. When she didn't respond, they assumed she had agreed and continued with their mourning. But that day she didn't go to the well. She didn't carry firewood. She drifted through the house like mist, present but evaporating. And then one morning she simply wasn't there. Her mat lay rolled neatly in the corner. Her calabash cup stood washed and drying near the clay pot. Her sandals remained tucked beside the doorway. The absence was too quiet to notice. Her mother stepped over the empty space where Nia usually sat. Her father prepared for the farm without asking where she was. Hours passed. By late afternoon, her little sister finally asked, "Where is Nia?" Her mother paused, frowned slightly, then shrugged. She must be outside. But evening came, then night, and still Nia did not return. It wasn't until the next morning, when her father asked for the hoe she usually fetched, that the weight of her absence settled over the house. They searched the compound, the well, the fields. She was nowhere. Word spread slowly through the village, carried on casual voices rather than urgency. "Has anyone seen the quiet one?" a woman asked at the market. "Which quiet one?" another replied with a laugh. "The one who never talks." "Perhaps she went to visit someone," someone else suggested. Who would she visit? She had no friends. The whispers floated around like drifting leaves, light and careless. She was always quiet. Maybe she left. Maybe she finally got tired of being invisible. No one raised an alarm. No one formed a search party. There was no gathering beneath the baobab tree to discuss her disappearance. Only murmurs, small and uncertain, slipping between daily chores. But almost immediately after she vanished, strange things began to happen. The first incident occurred near the market. A row of clay pots stacked outside a stall shattered without being touched. Shards flew outward as if pushed by unseen hands. The seller gasped and backed away, staring at the empty space in front of her. Then, during the night, the goats in the village began bleating and stamping as though someone moved among them. When the herders checked, the animals were clustered together, trembling, staring toward a patch of ground with no figure standing upon it. Children playing in the dust found their patterns disrupted by faint depressions that formed right beside them, as though someone stood watching. Even the elders felt a prickling unease each time they passed the baobab tree, as if a pair of unseen eyes followed their steps. It was only after these disturbances continued, subtle but unignorable, that the village finally paused long enough to remember Nia, too late to call her back, and too early to understand what her absence had awakened. At dawn on the fourth day after Nia's disappearance, the elders of Mbana awoke to murmurs rippling through the village like wind stirring tall grass. People gathered in uneasy clusters around the elder's hut, whispering urgently and pointing at the ground. There, in the soft dust that covered the clearing, were footprints, small, delicate, unmistakably those of a young woman. They led from the edge of the clearing straight to the entrance of the elder's hut, then vanished abruptly as if whoever made them had stepped into the air. The elders stood staring at them with furrowed brows. No one had approached their hut during the night. No one had kept watch and seen anything. The footprints had simply appeared, silent and deliberate, as though laid there with intention. Elder Chuma knelt, touching the soil. "Fresh," he murmured. "Very fresh." The morning air tightened with unease. Someone asked, "Whose feet are those?" Another answered in a hushed voice, "They look like hers, the quiet girl." But no one spoke her name. The strangest part of all came that night. When darkness fell and the moon rose pale above the baobab tree, children playing outside saw a faint shimmer along the path. At first they thought it was fireflies scattered on the ground. But as they moved closer, they saw the glowing shapes of footprints, small ovals of dim gold light, glowing as if the earth itself remembered the steps of someone who no longer walked there. The children screamed and ran into their homes, trembling, insisting they saw walking lights and shoes of fire. Parents scolded them for making up stories, but when they stepped outside to prove the night was quiet, they froze. The footprints were still there, flickering softly like embers. The next day, the trail of glowing footsteps stretched farther. Some appeared near the well. Others clustered around the market stalls. A few led toward the schoolhouse. But the ones that troubled the villagers most were those that appeared behind certain people. People who had mocked Nia, pushed past her, or spoken cruelly about her silence. Bako, the young man who used to laugh loudly whenever Nia passed, felt something behind him while he traded yams at the market. When he turned around, he saw a fresh footprint in the dust, forming right where there had been nothing a moment before. He stumbled backward, dropping his basket. "Someone is following me," he insisted, his voice breaking. His companions laughed nervously, but when more footprints appeared behind him, one after another, as though someone invisible stood only inches from his back, their laughter shriveled into fear. By the fifth day, the children of the village had begun following the footprints during daylight. Some were terrified but drawn in by curiosity. They whispered to one another, trying to guess where the steps would lead. Yet each time they followed a trail, it disappeared suddenly in a place where no person could vanish. A bare patch of earth, a corner behind a hut, the middle of a doorway. "She's hiding," a little boy whispered. "But not like a person hides." The older children nodded fearfully. The younger ones cried. Adults tried to sweep the prints away, but the dust settled again and the footprints returned. Hunters sprinkled flour around the elder's hut to test if an animal or intruder was causing it, but the flour remained untouched, except for the small, unmistakable marks that formed within it overnight. The elders began meeting in hushed urgency, debating whether these signs were warnings, messages, or curses. Nia herself remained unseen. No voice called out from the forest. No figure wandered the fields or paths at dusk. But her presence stretched through the village like a tightening net, felt in the breath of the wind, the shiver along one's spine, the strange awareness that someone walked nearby even when no one was there. In life they had overlooked her. In absence she had become impossible to ignore. The morning the marks appeared, the village awoke to gasps and shouts echoing from every direction. Women fetching water screamed when they saw pale handprints smeared across their doors, each one small and slender, as if formed by lightly pressing delicate fingers dipped in ash. At first, many believed mischievous children were responsible, but the handprints were too perfect. Each finger evenly spaced, the palms small and familiar in shape. They reminded people of the quiet girl who had vanished, though few dared speak her name aloud. At the market, traders found strange symbols drawn across their stalls. Some were curved like crescent moons, others sharp as thorn branches. They weren't random. They looked intentional, arranged with meaning that hovered just beyond understanding. A butcher discovered markings stretched across his wooden counter as though someone had trailed their fingertips purposefully, leaving behind a sequence of spirals and dots. The potter stared at a line of smudges circling the rims of her clay bowls, tiny fingerprints pressed in a perfect ring, as if someone invisible had turned the bowls slowly while marking them. But the greatest shock came from the chief's compound. The chief's wife was the first to scream when she entered their hut and saw a glowing mark on the inner wall, right above the place where the chief stored his secret documents. It was a perfect handprint, small and pale, pressed high enough that it must have belonged to someone light on their feet, someone who moved silently. The chief examined the wall closely. The handprint shimmered faintly even in daylight, as though refusing to fade. "This is no child's prank," he muttered, his voice low and troubled. "No one entered this room last night. No one." But deep down he remembered the way he had brushed past Nia dozens of times without acknowledging her, remembered the day she stood outside the elder's hut waiting to speak and he walked directly through the space she occupied. The memory tightened his chest uncomfortably. The elders gathered near the baobab tree, examining scraps of clay, bits of wood, and even woven straw that now carried symbols and tiny hand-shaped impressions. They debated loudly, fear sharpening their voices. "These are warnings. No, they are accusations. No spirit leaves marks like this." But their arguments circled endlessly because none of them understood the symbols. The language was unfamiliar, ancient, and hauntingly precise. It was old grandmother Mukami who first stepped forward, leaning heavily on her carved walking stick. Her hair was silver, her eyes clouded yet sharp. She had lived long enough to see patterns others ignored. When she examined the marks, her lips tightened. She touched a symbol gently, trailing her finger across it as though greeting an old memory. "These are not threats," she said slowly. "These are messages." The elders turned to her in confusion. Messages from whom? She lifted her gaze toward the forest, where a faint breeze rustled the leaves. "From the girl you never saw," she whispered. "From the one you let disappear." A chill spread through the crowd as her words sank in. For the first time, the villagers began to understand that Nia's absence was not emptiness but presence. Gathering, growing, speaking in the only way the world had ever forced her to speak. Grandmother Mukami had lived so long that many in the village believed she belonged to another age entirely. Her back was curved like a question mark shaped by decades of wisdom, and her thin fingers trembled only when she was still, never when she read signs or touched symbols. Children feared her, adults dismissed her, and the elders avoided her unless they needed someone to blame for an omen they could not interpret. Once years ago she had been the village seer, the woman people visited when newborns cried strangely or when goats refused to eat. But as time passed and the world grew louder, they decided they no longer needed the guidance of an old woman who spoke softly about spirits and silence. They replaced her knowledge with noise, forgetting the one person who had always listened carefully to the things no one else heard. But Mukami had not forgotten her purpose. She lived in a small hut on the far edge of the village, surrounded by herbs hung from the ceiling and stones carved with markings older than any living person. She kept to herself, boiling roots, muttering prayers and watching the world with half-closed eyes that missed nothing. When she heard the frightened whispers about footprints that glowed at night and handprints appearing where no hands had touched, she felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She had felt this once before, when she was a young woman learning from her own grandmother. An energy that belonged neither to the realm of the living nor the dead, something in between. When she approached the elders gathering beneath the baobab tree, the crowd parted uneasily. Grandmother Mukami was not a woman people sought out, but she was one they instinctively feared to disrespect. She leaned on her carved cane, each tap of her stick marking time between anxious breaths. Elder Chuma frowned at her arrival. "Mukami," he said, "you should be resting." She ignored him and knelt slowly beside the wooden slab covered in the mysterious symbols and handprints. Her fingers traced the smallest mark, a spiral etched with near-perfect precision. The moment her skin touched it, she inhaled sharply. "I know this," she murmured. "I have seen this language before." The villagers leaned closer, their fears sharpening into curiosity. Mukami continued tracing each symbol, her voice growing steadier. "This is the language of the unseen ones. Those who walk between silence and presence. Those who are overlooked in life but remembered by forces older than any of you." She lifted her eyes, cloudy yet bright with recognition. "These markings are not random. They are part of a spiritual tongue used only by people whose suffering has crossed into the realm of the sacred." A murmur spread through the villagers like a wave. Some scoffed. Others trembled. A few backed away as though the symbols might leap off the wood and cling to their skin. Elder Chuma swallowed hard. "Are you saying a spirit did this?" Mukami shook her head. "Not a spirit. A person touched by the unseen. Someone you ignored until her voice no longer needed a mouth to be heard." Her gaze swept the crowd, sharp as a blade. "Someone you mistreated." No one spoke, but every mind reached the same conclusion: Nia. Mukami tapped her cane once against the earth. "There are ancient powers that awaken when a soul is pushed too far into silence. They belong to those who move quietly, who watch and endure. The unseen ones walk beside people like Nia, waiting, listening, gathering strength from every moment of neglect." She closed her eyes, tilting her head slightly as if hearing distant footsteps. "And now they have risen." The chief's wife clutched her shawl tightly. "What does she want from us?" she whispered. Mukami opened her eyes. "Recognition. Truth. Acknowledgement of the wounds you left on her spirit." She pointed toward a doorway marked with glowing symbols. "These signs are warnings and messages. They mean she is no longer alone. Something ancient walks with her." A cold wind swept through the clearing as if the unseen ones exhaled across the village all at once. Grandmother Mukami leaned heavily. As days passed, the glowing footprints did not remain scattered at random. They began forming patterns, deliberate and precise, leading villagers along paths that revealed truths they had long ignored. In the early morning, a line of faintly shining steps appeared from the well and wound toward the small hut of Kofi, the young man who had stolen Nia's basket of yams months ago. The footprints stopped abruptly at his doorstep, and there, in the dust, he found a single imprint beside a smear of gold light that looked like a tiny hand pointing accusingly at him. Memories flooded him. The day he had taken her yams while she struggled to carry them home, the laughter of his friends echoing as she tripped over her own feet. His face went pale, guilt rooting him to the spot. Further along the village path, the footprints led to Adissa, the market woman who had sold Nia's handmade bracelets to travelers without giving her any share of the profit. The glowing marks twisted through the marketplace and stopped in front of her stall, where a circle of light traced the items she had taken. Each bracelet shimmered faintly under the glow, a subtle reminder of Nia's work and the betrayal hidden beneath the market's laughter and chatter. Adissa's heart pounded. She had laughed, scolded, and dismissed Nia for years, and now the very ground beneath her feet bore witness to her deeds. The path wound further, curling around the baobab tree and moving toward the compound where Nia had once helped her neighbor, Elder Chuma, with chores he barely noticed. Here, the footprints slowed, forming a small circle of glowing impressions around a hidden stash of millet that had been hoarded months ago. The elder stared at the trail, comprehension dawning. He remembered ignoring her, forgetting her contributions, letting her work go unpraised while he took the credit for her labor. The footprints were not just showing him the ground. They were revealing the lies and selfishness that had reshaped Nia's opportunities in the village. Most painful of all, the footprints led to the house of her closest friend, Luma, the one person she had trusted. There, in the hallway where they had shared secrets and laughter, a small trail of steps stopped abruptly. One mark was different, a faint imprint shaped like a heart, followed by a line leading to the corner where a piece of paper lay hidden. The paper, now illuminated by the faint glow, revealed Luma's betrayal, the words written carefully and secretly, exposing the lies she had told the elders to take Nia's small inheritance. Nia's steps had traced the betrayal carefully, ensuring that every lie, every deceit, would be uncovered in time. Villagers began to see the pattern. Nia's footsteps did not merely wander aimlessly, they traced the paths of deceit, injustice, and theft, connecting every action and consequence. The footprints glowed faintly at night, guiding the children and elders who dared to follow them, illuminating the truth hidden in plain sight. Each mark was a silent accusation, a story told by absence, a revelation that demanded acknowledgement. No house, no path, no secret remained untouched. Every footprint was a whisper: the truth cannot be buried, and those who forget the quiet girl will finally see the weight of their deeds. Through these paths, Nia's presence grew ever stronger, her silent voice now a trail of light, unyielding and unstoppable, exposing the fractures and betrayals of the village one step at a time. The sky darkened suddenly, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. By late afternoon the wind had picked up, twisting dust and leaves into small whirlwinds that danced across the village paths. Clouds churned overhead, heavy and bruised, blotting out the sun. Villagers hurried to secure their homes, clutching doors and shutters, muttering prayers under their breath. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the thatched roofs and rattling clay pots. Then the rain fell, at first soft, then pounding, drenching everything in a relentless torrent. The river swelled, streams ran muddy, and the village paths turned to slippery ribbons of dark water. Amid the chaos, something impossible appeared. Footprints, small, slender, delicate, began forming on the wet ground. Each step glowed faintly, faintly enough to be noticed only at the edge of vision, reflecting lightning flashes as if illuminated from within. They moved through puddles, across mud, and along slippery planks, leaving trails that no one could erase. Villagers screamed as they saw them, a glowing trail forming where no human could possibly walk, steps that appeared and disappeared as though Nia herself moved invisibly through the storm. Mothers pulled children close, farmers gripped sticks, and elders whispered hurried prayers to ancestors, fearing spirits and curses in equal measure. Yet at the center of the village, beneath the massive baobab tree, Grandmother Mukami stood calmly. Her silver hair whipped around her face, soaked by the rain, but her eyes were steady. Her cane dug into the wet soil, marking her presence, and her lips moved in soft murmurs that carried over the storm as though calling someone, or something, back from the unseen. The villagers froze, half in awe, half in terror. "Mukami," one cried, "do you not fear?" She shook her head slowly, her voice barely rising above the wind. "I fear nothing," she said. "Tonight, the girl will show herself, and you will see what it means to be ignored." As lightning forked across the sky, illuminating every corner of the village in stark white, a faint silhouette emerged. It moved gracefully, almost gliding between huts and across puddles, small and human-shaped yet shimmering with an ethereal light. Nia's form was there, walking silently among the terrified villagers, her glowing footprints leaving a path in the rain. Some could not see her clearly, seeing only the shimmer of the footprints, the flash of a shadow moving with the lightning. Others glimpsed her faint outline, a young woman standing straight and proud, soaked by the storm, yet radiating a presence far stronger than any force of nature around her. The villagers cried out in confusion and fear. Footsteps appeared behind them, tracing their movements even as they ran, leaving glowing trails along the wet paths. The elders whispered, clutching each other, "It is the girl, she is here." The market stalls, upended by wind and water, bore her marks, her footprints circling piles of goods, marking spaces of deceit and cruelty. Each mark told a story, where she had been overlooked, where she had been harmed, where the villagers had chosen their own convenience over seeing her. Mukami raised her arms toward the storm, calling Nia by name, her voice unwavering despite the raging wind. "Come forward, child of silence. Walk among them. Let them feel what it is to be unseen." The silhouette paused, seeming to acknowledge the call, and then continued her slow, deliberate march across the village. Rain-soaked faces turned upward, lightning illuminated the faint glow of each footprint, and for the first time, every villager realized that they could no longer deny her presence. She was no longer invisible. She was power, she was light, she was reckoning made manifest. The storm raged on, but in the midst of it, a girl long ignored became impossible to overlook. The storm did not silence her, it carried her. The wind twisted through the village paths like a chorus, and in its sound, a voice emerged, soft at first, then rising with the steady strength of long-forged patience. Nia spoke, though no lips moved, no shadow formed the shape of her words. The villagers froze, the rain hammering their shoulders, the mud beneath their feet turning to slip as they strained to listen. Her voice came through the storm, through the glowing footprints, through every mark etched upon walls and doors. It was calm, yet every syllable cut sharper than a knife, each word impossible to ignore. "You walked past me," her voice said, drifting into every corner of their minds. You laughed when I tried to speak. You acted as if I were air, as if my steps made no sound. You called me quiet, invisible, unworthy. You took what belonged to me and celebrated it as your own. You ignored my cries, my presence, my work, my heart. Every villager felt it. Each accusation struck precisely where their own wrongdoing had left a mark on the world. Bako felt it in his chest as he remembered stealing her yams. Adissa trembled at the memory of the bracelets she sold and kept for herself. Elder Chuma's knees shook as he recalled claiming her labor as his own. Even those who had been merely indifferent felt a pang, a sudden awareness of the small cruelties they had dismissed as nothing. Her voice was not loud, it needed no volume to resonate. It reached inside them, touching the parts they had tried to hide from themselves. You believed my silence meant weakness, she continued, but silence is not empty. It is depth. It is witness. It is memory. You built your lives on ignoring me, and yet every step I took, every breath I drew, every thought I had was recorded in the air, in the soil, in the eyes of those who watched quietly, unseen. The rain intensified, pounding harder on roofs and earth, as if nature itself joined her testimony. The footprints glowed brighter, tracing patterns of accusation across mud and puddles, each step a narrative of truth laid bare. Her voice softened slightly, yet carried the weight of years endured. And now you see. Now you remember what you did. Now you feel what it cost me. No wall, no door, no silence can hide the reality of your deeds. You cannot erase what I am. You cannot ignore what I have become. Every mark you see, every footprint you follow, every whisper of wind is my voice. I am here. I am present. I am remembered. The villagers pressed hands to their faces, some weeping openly, others paralyzed by guilt and awe. The words were not threats, not curses, but revelations. Each word was a wound and a mirror showing them themselves and the harm they had done. They could not run. They could not deny. For the first time, they heard her fully, and for the first time, they recognized the power they had long refused to see in the girl they thought invisible. The morning after Nia's voice echoed through the storm, the village of Mbana awoke to a silence heavier than any they had known. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles reflecting the bruised sky and muddy footprints that pulsed faintly with the glow of her presence. The villagers emerged from their homes cautiously, eyes wide and hearts heavy. Each person found traces of Nia's steps leading directly to them, snaking through their doorways, across their floors and curling around their yards. The footprints were no longer just her path, they were a map of every wrong, every slight, every cruelty, each one illuminated in delicate gold light. Some villagers fell immediately to their knees, overwhelmed by the weight of guilt. Bako pressed his forehead to the wet earth, unable to speak, tears mixing with mud. He remembered every time he shoved her aside, every mocking word that had been flung carelessly while she passed unnoticed. Each footprint glowing around him seemed to whisper, "This is your doing." Adissa, the market woman, staggered as she saw the steps tracing her theft of Nia's bracelets, every stolen item marked by a faint, radiant print. She clutched her chest, her breaths coming in shallow, panicked bursts, realizing that the girl she had dismissed for years now held a power that exposed her completely. Others tried to flee, running toward the forest or along the village paths, hoping to escape the confrontation that had overtaken every street and home. But the footprints moved faster than they could run. They appeared at each corner, each doorway, each step ahead and behind, shimmering faintly in the sunlight like a trail of memory they could not erase. They were not merely following them, they were reflecting them, revealing every misdeed they had hoped would remain hidden. No one could outrun the marks of their own actions, for these were not simply Nia's steps. They were a record of every slight, every ignored plea, every cruel jest, every unacknowledged act that had built the invisible cage around her life. Even the elders who had once dismissed Nia's presence as trivial, were caught in the reckoning. Elder Chuma's knees shook as he traced the glowing lines leading to the millet he had hoarded, the labor he had claimed, the moments he had ignored her entirely. The marks wound around him like invisible chains, binding him to the reality he had long evaded. He clasped his hands and whispered prayers, but the prince shimmered onward, indifferent to his attempts at appeasement. Grandmother Makami watched from the center of the village, leaning on her cane, her eyes calm and knowing. She had seen this before in visions, though never with such intensity. She understood that the footprints were not merely punishment, they were teaching. Each glowing step was a lesson, a mirror, a call to see and acknowledge the truth. Those who bent low to the ground began to understand the depth of Nia's endurance, the courage required to exist in a world that had chosen to overlook her. By midday the reckoning had transformed the village. Some villagers wept openly, kneeling in mud and puddles, their guilt exposed and raw. Others huddled in corners, refusing to meet the truth but unable to ignore the glowing evidence tracing their deeds. Even as they tried to escape, the footprints followed, unrelenting, insistent, and precise. Nia did not need to speak for them to feel her presence, for the path she had carved was a voice far louder than any shout. The girl who had been invisible had become inescapable. Every glowing step reminded them that cruelty cannot hide from reckoning, that injustice leaves an imprint, and that even the faintest, quietest soul can leave marks no one can ever erase. As the days passed after the storm, the atmosphere in Bana began to change. The fear that had gripped the villagers slowly softened, replaced by a mixture of awe, reflection, and cautious hope. Nia's presence lingered still, but it had transformed. The glowing footprints that had once haunted the paths and homes now pulsed with a gentler light, like the first rays of dawn spilling over the earth. They no longer traced only the wrongs of the past. They illuminated new possibilities, a quiet invitation to live differently, to see differently, to honor the unseen. For those who had fallen to their knees in genuine repentance, the footprints became a form of blessing. Bako, still shivering from the memory of his cruelty, noticed that the prints leading to his doorstep now glimmered warmly. He stepped cautiously onto them, and for the first time he felt not guilt alone but release, a silent acknowledgement that his recognition of her pain mattered. Adissa, who had once hoarded Nia's bracelets and laughed at her work, saw the glow circling her stall soften, as if the footprints themselves were saying, "You may now walk forward with honesty." Each person who had opened their heart to remorse felt the weight of their past lifted slightly, as if Nia's spirit, though still present, now sought not revenge but reconciliation. The children who had always watched Nia quietly and never mocked her, found themselves guided by her light. The small steps she left behind glowed more brightly for them, weaving paths that led to safe spaces, to wells filled with fresh water, to trees perfect for climbing and learning. She became their guardian in subtle ways, keeping them from harm, showing them the paths through the forest, and leaving the faintest marks on their doorsteps, a reminder that they were seen, valued, and protected. Grandmother Mukami observed the change with a calm smile. "See," she whispered to the elders, "the girl who was once ignored is now guiding us all. Her power does not lie in fear alone but in clarity, forgiveness, and protection. The footprints you feared now teach us how to live in her light." Even the elders who had once doubted her wisdom, felt the truth of her words. The glow of Nia's presence no longer threatened, it illuminated. In every corner of the village the transformation was evident. The market, once a place of greed and neglect, became a space where fairness and recognition mattered. The elders' hut, where secrets had once been hoarded, now shone with footprints marking paths of understanding and counsel. Even the children who had never met her in life felt her guidance, sensing that every small kindness, every gentle word, every act of acknowledgement was part of the light she had left behind. Nia's spirit, once a silent witness and avenger, now became a presence of hope. Her footsteps no longer carried accusation but affirmation. The village learned to follow her steps not in fear, but in gratitude, in awareness, and in respect. She had been invisible once, overlooked and dismissed, but now, through her light, she became the heart of Mbana itself, a quiet, unwavering guide whose wisdom and compassion touched every path, every soul, and every life in the village. The girl who was never seen had become the light by which all others could finally see. The morning air was thick with the memory of rain, but the sun now cut through the lingering clouds in sharp, brilliant rays. Bana had changed. The streets that had once echoed with indifference and scorn now pulsed with cautious life, tempered by reflection. The villagers moved carefully, eyes cast toward paths they had learned to follow, mindful of footprints that glimmered faintly at the edges of their vision. Yet even as they took tentative steps toward a new day, there was an anticipation in the air, as though something, or someone, was about to appear who could change everything. And then she came. Nia appeared at the edge of the main square, walking with a grace that had always been there but never noticed. She was 23, a young woman with a quiet strength that radiated from every movement, every glance. The villagers stopped in their tracks, mouths opening, hearts tightening. It was not fear they felt but awe, a sense that the world had shifted while they slept. She was not a spirit, not a vision of the storm, not a glowing trail in the dust. She was flesh and bone, present in ways they had denied for years, yet she carried the same ethereal power that had haunted their nights. Her footsteps fell softly onto the earth, and even without the faint glow that had once accompanied them, they felt weighty, deliberate, and full of meaning. The elders fell to their knees, bowing their heads in reverence. Grandmother Mukami remained standing, her cane tapping the ground gently as she watched the culmination of years of endurance and injustice. "She is here," Mukami whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. "Not hidden. Not ignored. Not unseen. She is finally seen." Nia's eyes scanned the village, lingering on every face. She looked at those who had mocked her, those who had ignored her, and those who had betrayed her trust. Yet there was no fury in her gaze, not the hot, reckless anger of someone broken by injustice, but a quiet, unwavering strength that carried the weight of every insult, every slight, every whisper that had ever passed over her. She was present, fully, powerfully, and she was no longer invisible. She raised her hand slowly, and the villagers instinctively bowed lower, as though drawn by a force they could not name. Her voice, when it came, was soft yet carried across the square with absolute clarity. "I have walked among you in silence. I have been invisible while you built your lives on the assumption that I did not exist. And yet I watched. I learned. I endured. I moved. I left marks in the world that could not be ignored. And now, I am here." Her words were not accusatory but declarative. Each syllable resonated through the hearts of the villagers. They felt the weight of their own actions, the small cruelties and thoughtless dismissals they had inflicted. Bako, who had laughed when she stumbled, remembered the basket of yams he had stolen. Adissa, who had claimed her work, felt the sharp pang of guilt at each bracelet she had hoarded. Elder Chuma recalled every time he had taken credit for her labor and ignored her efforts. Each person's heart was bare before her, exposed not through anger but through the undeniable presence of the one they had overlooked. The children, those who had watched quietly and never mocked, stepped forward. Their small faces reflected awe and recognition. Nia bent slightly, touching their heads, and a smile flickered across her lips. Where she had once been silent, unseen, she now offered guidance and protection, leaving them with the knowledge that attention, care, and respect mattered. Her footsteps, even now, seemed to leave traces in the dust, soft impressions that glimmered faintly, leading the children toward lessons of kindness and awareness. Her return transformed the village not only through presence but through action. She walked through the marketplace, touching stalls and wares, and the people followed her steps with reverence, seeing the world anew through the lens of recognition. Markets once dominated by greed were now spaces of fairness, and elders who had hoarded power now shared wisdom with humility. Families once fractured by thoughtless disregard began to repair themselves, guided by the example of Nia's enduring patience and undeniable strength. Everywhere she went, the footprints told a story. They were no longer marks of accusation, nor mere warnings. They became trails of light, teaching the villagers that presence, even quiet and ignored, carries power. They illuminated what had been lost, what had been overlooked, and what could be restored. They reminded everyone that the smallest voice, the quietest observer, leaves impressions deeper than the loudest shout. Nia paused at the edge of the village, near the baobab tree where Grandmother Mukami had first interpreted the symbols and messages she had left. Her gaze swept over the houses, the market, the paths where her footsteps had traced injustices, and the children who had never harmed her. She spoke again, her voice calm, gentle, and powerful. "Invisible people leave the deepest marks. Do not forget this. See each other. Honor each other. And remember that what is quiet and unseen is never powerless." The villagers wept openly, some with relief, others with lingering guilt. Yet there was no fear now, only recognition, respect, and the slow dawning of understanding. Nia turned slowly, walking along a path where her footprints glimmered faintly, leading the children who followed her silently, the elders who dared to witness, and the villagers who had learned to see. As she walked, the sun broke fully through the clouds, flooding Bana with light. The footprints faded slightly in the brightness but remained visible enough to guide anyone willing to look. Nia's presence was no longer a haunting memory or a lesson of fear. It was the very heart of the village, a living testament to resilience, patience, and the quiet power of being truly seen. In the days and years that followed, Nia became legend. Mothers told their daughters about the quiet girl whose silence was stronger than their laughter, whose footsteps illuminated truth, whose presence transformed an entire village. Her story traveled beyond Bana, carried in whispers, songs, and the glimmering memory of footprints left behind. Every child learned that invisibility is never weakness, that silence is never absence, and that even the smallest person, overlooked and ignored, can leave marks no one can erase. And so, the village changed forever. Nia, the woman once invisible, walked among them as a living beacon, her footsteps a guide, her presence a reminder, and her legacy a lesson to generations. that those we fail to see are often the ones who shape the world most profoundly, and that every life, no matter how quiet, leaves a mark deeper than anyone can imagine. The girl who had been invisible had returned, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for justice, for healing, and for the enduring truth that being seen is the greatest power of all. The village of Mbana, once blind to her, would never forget her again.